On the morning of November 13th, 1963, Lackland Elementary School student Jesse was looking at one of his classroom windows while his teacher was giving a lesson. Looking through the window, Jesse could see the many bunkers and hills that reside at Medina Base. Suddenly, Jesse saw a humongous explosion at Medina Base that created a mushroom cloud. Before Jesse could ask his teacher what was happening to Medina Base, the sound of the explosion hit the school, causing all of the school's windows to explode. Glass was flying everywhere, the ground was shaking, and both adults and children were panicking. Although shaken by the explosion, Jesse remained calm and followed the protocols of duck and cover. After being under his desk for a few minutes, the principal announced on the school PA system to leave their classroom and head to the emergency area of the school. It took a couple of months before many of the students and teachers were able to mentally recover from the explosion, recounts Jesse, who is now in his 60s. Jesse was one of the many witnesses who saw the 1963 Medina explosion that literally shook the city of San Antonio. This is one of the many historical events that has been forgotten to the public until now. I'm your host, Streetlight Historian, and I will be covering this explosive history that has been forgotten by the public of San Antonio. In this episode, I will cover the history of the 1963 Medina explosion that literally shook the city of San Antonio to its core. The explosion itself was not only heard by the city of San Antonio, but it has been estimated by some to have been heard from over 100 miles. To understand this forgotten history, we must investigate the history of Medina Base itself.
Well, it was originally called Medina Base, and it opened in the 1950s, the early 1950s, by the Department of Energy. And it was part of the Sandia lab experiments that were happening in New Mexico for nuclear weapons and the care for them, breaking them apart, the inspections and whatnot. So this happened at a few locations in the States, and Medina just happened to be one of those locations here in San Antonio. So it originally belonged to the Department of Energy. We didn't call it, it wasn't an Air Force base per se, but it was a location for this type of work. It was sealed, of course. We had security. They had their own guards wrapped around the base there, the area, the installation. It didn't become part of the Air Force. It didn't come into the Air Force inventory until the early 1960s, as a matter of fact. So we started taking over bits and pieces of it when the DOE transitioned a lot of the material, a lot of the training, the testing they were doing on nuclear weapons and the various components of these weapons. They moved them back to New Mexico, to the Sandia labs. So they ended up turning over a large portion of the installation to the United States Air Force. It was convenient because Kelly was right there, Lackland was right next to it. And so the Air Force put a stamp strap unit there. It was a munitions organization, and what they did with the igloos, and there were a number of igloos built over there, They were hardened structures that we housed bombs and other munitions in. Simply put, if one were to blow up inside the igloo, you might never know it. There'd be a little bump and whatnot, because they're hardened and reinforced structures there. But the Air Force put a munitions organization there. It was out of Hill Air Force Base. So it was a detachment from an organization at Hill Air Force Base that came here. And we stored munitions there. And it was something most people never really knew about. But the munitions would be packaged up, put on trucks, convoyed over to Kelly, where they would go onto airplanes and sent to wherever they needed to go. In fact, in the modern era, a lot of the weapons that we used in Desert Shield, Desert Storm, mind you, Shield was the protection gauge, and then Desert Storm was actually going into and taking out Saddam. But a lot of the weapons used during Desert Storm were shipped from Medina Base at that point. The Air Force, save for using the igloos, we also had plenty of space on there for training. So we had a portion of our technical training school that was put over there, specifically security forces, or at the time, air police. So we moved some of their training from Lackland proper, a mile and a half down the road to Medina. And the next larger organization to make use of the property there was the Officer Training School, which was here on Lackland proper, and then we moved them over there. There was some hiccups moving OTS over there at the time, mainly due to the lack of infrastructure. There were no chow halls, dining facilities as we call it today, gyms and other administrative buildings. So a lot of that had to be built up specifically for OTS. But in general, that's it. I mean, it started off as a Department of Energy installation, and then they turned it over to the Department of the Air Force, really beginning in the late 1950s into the 60s when we started moving things over. What events led to it? It was a mistake. Somebody tripped. They dropped the bomb. They realized they dropped the bomb, and they ran, which was good for them because the bomb blew up, and they kept running. There was no, there wasn't anything, how to say it, nefarious about it. There were a group of men that were transporting munitions back into one of the igloos, and a munition, maybe, I don't know the very particular about it. I believe it might have been a strap that came loose from the machine they were using to lift and transport the munition, and the bomb actually rolled off. Now, the explosion itself, oh goodness, it was huge. It was huge. It was a bit of a mushroom cloud, mind you, but it was a non-nuclear explosion. Everyone thought that it was a nuclear bomb that went off. It was a non-nuclear explosion. However, there were some radioactive components there. There was testing that was accomplished, soon after and in the days and weeks after the explosion. But the initial cause, it was an accident. It really was. We had a group of guys that were, they were working there, and like I said, they were moving the munitions back into one of the igloos. A bomb rolled off, hit the ground, and they did pretty much what any good munitions troop would have done. They told any and everybody around them that they needed to be with them or in front of them to be safe. They ran. Can't blame them. Well, from the official standpoint, we had, the dust hadn't really settled from the explosion itself, and there was a sniffer plane. It was a plane that did radiological testing, airborne radiological testing that came in from Colorado. And the plane was in the air literally just a couple of hours after the explosion happened. And the plane made a number of trips around San Antonio, taking air samples to find out, because initially they weren't positive that it was not, in fact. People believed that it was. All right, so officially, the people that worked on Medina, Lackland, the official lines, we knew it was not a nuclear explosion. But we knew there were components, nuclear components that were stored there. So the concern were the radiological components. Was that going to spread around the city? We looked at, of course, the weather to find out the airflow, which way was the wind blowing. So we had airborne radiological detectors. We had a lot of ground-based ones as well. And we're talking people in uniform and probably out of uniform, driving marked and unmarked cars all around the area where the weather was taking the cloud and potential material and sampling the air, sampling soil. And this happened for months afterwards, and there were any number of reports that came up. The good news was that all of the samples that they took relayed that it was, for the most part, simple background radiation, the same amount of radiation you would see or test anywhere in the United States. So there was nothing specific about what had happened there. Of course, you wouldn't have believed that to see the crater that was left there in front of of course, the igloo itself was destroyed, but the rumor mill, however, was a whole another story. As a matter of fact, one of the more interesting ones was there was a gentleman that was flying a light aircraft not long after the explosion occurred and had just the perfect photograph of this quasi-mushroom cloud over the installation. I mean, it was a beautiful picture. It ended up at the front page of the news. And I always thought that was a conspiracy there myself, just seeing that. How was he there at that time with the camera to see that? But yeah, it's not. I just say it to get other people upset, really. Save for that, there were no other issues of radiological concern. But still, rumors persist even today that that was all a lie, it was all a cover-up, and that a lot of the issues that stem from Kelly started at Medina, and people oftentimes get the two mixed up. There are a lot of issues with the groundwater and contamination around the former Kelly Air Force Base. It really is. But you have to consider that, and I'll use the term back in the day, we didn't know any better. We had the fuels that we didn't need it, we dumped it onto the ground. Get absorbed to the ground, and it wasn't our problem anymore. So that was done at a number of Air Force bases, in the 40s going into the 70s, until we finally realized we need to capture, that fuel, that oil, those other contaminants, and put them in containers and dispose of them properly. So this wasn't a widespread thing really until, I'm going to suggest, probably into the early 80s, honestly, because as a former member of the Air Force, former flight line worker, working on F-15s, when the F-15 fighter shuts down its engines, it dumps a little bit of fuel. Not a lot, but it adds up. You get 2 or 3 squadrons and they're all shutting down their engines every day. It's dumping fuel onto the ground. And so when I first got into the Air Force, it wasn't a deal. All you had to do was make sure you were not under the fuel port where it was dumping. Not long after I was in, we were told we had to capture it. So we had to be underneath there with a bucket and then put that spent fuel into a container. This was the 80s. This was the late 80s we started doing this. So you can imagine, go back 3 or 4 decades where we're just letting the fuel hit the ground. There and at Kelly, that was a major depot for all Air Force aircraft. It's not a surprise to me that the government, the United States government, had to declare any number of areas Superfund sites where you had to cordon off certain parts of the base or the whole installation that had closed to the general public in order to do a rather intensive cleanup of the area.
Yeah.
So, relating back to the Medina explosion in 1963, we didn't have to do any of that really. They continued to test, and I believe even today in 2021, once every couple of years they do some testing out there for the soil. But it's not just because of that explosion, it's because we had tens upon tens of igloos that housed munitions, and we had other facilities where they took the munitions apart, they tested them, and there's a little bit of contamination of various types at certain places that do require cleanup. Not on a wide scale, mind you, but just a smaller scale, taking the dirt, maybe going down 40, 50 feet, removing all of that soil and getting it taken care of. But the one thing that happened in the United States that pretty much overshadowed the 1963 explosion was the assassination of President Kennedy. That occurred just about a month or so later, for crying out loud. When that occurred, that took over the news headlines, of course. And despite the fact that the explosion of Medina took out windows miles away and really shook people to the core, the assassination of President Kennedy overshadowed everything else. But still, an interesting story and an interesting part of San Antonio history.